So, without further ado, um, let me now introduce Bet Hucks. Um, Bet is a fourth year PhD candidate at Heidelberg University, researching Egyptian influence on Imperial Roman art, architecture, and cultural identity, and is an activist for disability accessibility. Her PhD deals with imperial era Roman usage of Egyptian material in art, religion, and cultural identity. She uses databases and 3D models to analyze materiality and object assemblages within their spatial context. She spends summers working on pottery for various Bronze Age excavations, and she is a professional grammar, content, CV cover letter, sensitivity editor, and translator from Italian and Spanish to English. Her paper today is entitled The Quote Unquote Mainstream and Global Minoritization, Dismantling Assumptions of Common Cultural Backgrounds in Western Classics. So please take it away, Bet Hucks.
Hello, everybody. For those of you who cannot see me, I am a light-skinned Black American woman with curly hair. I am wearing a gray cowl neck cape thing, and I have earrings made out of colored pencils. This talk will be focusing less on the philosophical discussion around what is mainstream in classics and more around the practical application of what we as speakers, lecturers, and teachers can do to make our classrooms and our lectures more accessible to people who do not have this quote unquote mainstream background. I also would like to say that anti-Asian racism and the myth of the model minority are rooted in white supremacist ideology and linked very closely to anti-Blackness. We are all in this together, and ignoring anti-Asian racism, because for many members of, particularly white members of Western society, just becoming aware of how deeply anti-Blackness and other racism is rooted in our institutions, anti-racism may not seem as bad or as urgent, is completely unacceptable. They're all tied in together. None of us is free until all of us are free. So yes, do not waver. The road is long and we may be weary, but we have miles to go yet and we can get there together. So I'm going to start this talk by discussing who's in charge of DEI initiatives at academic institutions. While Black and Indigenous people of color, that I will now refer to going forward as BIPOC, can reinforce the systems of white supremacy and also have to unlearn their technical illusions. This talk is aimed primarily at white teachers and speakers and researchers in particular, as it is harder to decenter pedagogical whiteness if you do not have the experience recognizing it in practice. Many white people in North America and in Europe have never been the minority in a room. That experience alone changes the way that you think about what is mainstream and what experiences are considered standard within society. So it usually is slightly easier for people of color to begin that road to unpacking the difference between mainstream and personal. People in charge of DEI initiatives are still on the whole white people. Many of them are white women, but putting white women in charge will not fix broader issues for BIPOC, as white women are also as much entangled in the origins of white supremacy in the West. For more of this, you can see Stephanie Jones Rod's book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. Similarly, putting the one BIPOC person in your department in charge of DEI efforts with zero institutional support will not result in the recruitment and specifically the retention of BIPOC students. BIPOC students may see someone who looks like them and be excited about joining the department, but if they experience the same microaggressions with no institutional support, with no support from peers, they will leave. And that is how we get this pipeline where there are lots of BIPOC who study Greco-Roman mythology and history in middle and high school, the same as their white peers. And then by the time you get to higher education, we are almost none. And that is true across the West, in Europe and in North America. If departments are serious about these efforts, they need to pay BIPOC DEI workers for their labor and provide institutional support and funding for community outreach and recruitment efforts. They also need to back restructuring and implicit bias training, sensitivity editors, and mentorship initiatives for BIPOC scholars and students. And you can work with your departments. There are ways to do this even with limited funding. And I'm hoping that on the Sportula website, we can upload some resources there later this week if we don't already have them linked. I also want to discuss this idea that decolonizing is not the same as diversity. Representation does little to nothing to dismantle structures that make academia inaccessible for people of color. A now famous example of this is Meghan Markle, who stated that she would have been a wonderful representative of the British royal family and an example for BIPOC to look up to. The backlash among African and Indian and Pakistani diaspora communities was swift, as many of us see no need to look up to a genocidal, wealth-stealing family and head of state. Now I'm going to provide some examples of micro and macroaggressions that I personally have experienced in classics growing up and as a student and a researcher. I generally do not believe in performing BIPOC pain for primarily white audiences, but in this case, I think that this is a good opportunity to help people become aware of how small decisions and uncritical frameworks cause damage to your students and colleagues of color. Content warning for descriptions of racial violence and discrimination. So the first is going to be the hardest, like the roughest example to listen to. So Nicolette and Jonah's example of the uncritical educator was not the only major incident around racism that took place at this year's AIA SCS conference. One white woman who spoke on the president's panel and specializes in race in the American South showed photos of lynching and grotesque and explicit violence on Black bodies. She had to be checked live during the Q&A by the president for showing them without a content warning. And the president is a senior Black woman scholar. This is ostensibly someone who has training and experience in discussing these issues. And it had not occurred to her to provide a content warning because she assumed that the audience, like herself, could emotionally detach themselves and view these scenes from a quote unquote neutral distance. However, it left me pretty shook. I can barely remember the rest of the talk because I was on the edge of my seat, constantly worried whether she would display additional images like those. This is a trauma that is actively continuing in my community every day. I cannot and should not be forced to be neutral in the face of these atrocities. And it is impossible for me to sit passively in a lecture where people do not address these issues critically. So with that in mind, imagine being a Black student discussing ancient slavery and expecting to be objective when reading National Latin exam questions or Cambridge Latin examples of happy or lazy slaves with their white instructors and peers, or a Latina student discussing ancient migration in the current climate, especially in North America and Europe. Particularly at the level of middle and high school pedagogy, students may not feel empowered to push back for fear of reprisal. In addition, schools at this level position themselves as places of knowing and learning rather than places of questioning. The power dynamic is designed to emphasize the teacher as imparting knowledge that is to some level objectively true, which can have knock-on effects that reinforce societal dynamics around race, as well as those between students of different backgrounds.